joining during the live time. I have taken just a couple of minute break, and we're going to finish up the second Maccabees, chapter 11 through 15. The first campaign of Lysias. Chapter 11. Almost immediately afterwards, Lysias, I was saying Lysias, but Lysias, the king's tutor and cousin, chief minister of the realm, much disturbed at the turn of events, mustered about 80,000 foot soldiers and his entire cavalry, and advanced against the Jews, intending to make the city a place for Greeks to live in, to levy a tax on the temple as on other national shrines, and to put the office on high priest, or the office of high priest, up for sale every year. He took no account at all the power of God, being sublimely confident in his tens of thousands of infantrymen, his thousands of cavalry, and his 80 elephants. Invading Judea, he approached Beth-zur, a fortified position about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and began to subject it to strong pressure. When Maccabeus and his men learned that Lysias was besieging the fortresses, they and the populace with them begged the Lord with lamentation and tears to send a good angel to save Israel. Maccabeus himself was the first to take up his weapons, and he urged the rest to risk their lives with him in support of their brothers. So they sallied out resolutely as one man. They were still near Jerusalem when a rider attired in white appeared at their head, brandishing golden weapons. With one accord, they all blessed the God of mercy, and found themselves filled with such courage that they were ready to lay low not men only, but the fiercest beast and walls of iron. They advanced in battle, order with the aid of their celestial ally, the Lord having had mercy on them, charging like lions on the enemy. They laid low 11,000 of the infantry and 1,600 horsemen, and routed all the rest. Of course, the majority got away, wounded and weaponless. Lysias himself escaped only by flight. Now Lysias was not lacking in intelligence, and as he reflected on the reverse he had just suffered, he realized that the Hebrews were invincible because the mighty God fought for them. He therefore sent them a delegation to persuade them to accept terms all around, and promised to compel the king to become their friend. Maccabeus, thinking only of the common good, agreed to all that Lysias proposed, and whatever Maccabeus submitted to Lysias in writing concerning the Jews was granted by the king. Here is the text of the letter Lysias wrote to the Jews. Lysias, to the Jewish people, greetings. John and Absalom, your envoys, have delivered to me the communication transcribed below, requesting me to approve its provisions. Anything requiring the king's attention I have put before him. Whatever was possible, I have granted, provided you maintain your goodwill towards the interest of the state. I shall do my best in the future to promote your well-being. As regards the details, I have given orders for your envoys and my own officials to discuss these with you. May you prosper. The 24th day of Dioscorus, in the year 148. The king's letter ran as follows. King Antiochus to his brother Lysias, greetings. Now that our Father has taken his place among the gods, little g, our will is that the subjects of the realm be left undisturbed to attain their own affairs. We understand that the Jews do not approve our Father's policy, the adoption of Greek customs, but prefer their own way of life and ask to be allowed to observe their own laws. Accordingly, since we intend this people to be free from vexation like any other, our ruling is that the temple be restored to them and that they conduct their affairs according to the customs of their ancestors. It will therefore be your concern to send them a mission of friendship, so that on learning our policy they may have confidence and happily go about their business. The king's letter to the Jewish nation was in these terms: King Antiochus to the Jewish Senate and the rest of the Jews, greetings. If you are well, that is, as we would wish, we ourselves are in good health. Menelaus informs us that you wish to return home and attend to your own affairs. Accordingly, all those who return before the 13th day of here we go again. Exanthicus may rest assured that they have nothing to fear. The Jews may make use of their own kind of food and their own laws as formerly, and none of them is to be molested in any way for any unwitting offenses. I am in fact sending Menelaus to set your minds at rest. Farewell. Well, the 15th day of Exanthicus, if I'm saying that right, in the year 148, the Romans also sent the Jews a letter which reads as follows: Quintus Memmius, Titus, Menelaus, Manius, Sargius, legates of the Romans, it says legates of the Romans, to the people of the Jews, greetings. Whatever Lysias, the king's cousin, has granted you, we also approve. As for the matters he decided to refer to the king, consider them carefully and send some one without delay, if we are to interpret them to your advantage, because we are leaving for Antioch. Lose no time, therefore, in sending us those who can tell us what your intentions are. Farewell. The 15th day of Dioscorus, or Dioscorus, in the year 148. Chapter 12. Incidents at Joppa and Jamnia. These agreements once concluded, Lysias returned to the king, and the Jews went back to their farming. Among the local generals, Timotheus and Apollonius, son of Gennaeus, as also Hieronymus and Demophon and Nicanor, the Cypriarch, as well, would not allow the Jews to live in peace and quiet. The people of Joppa committed a particularly wicked crime. They invited the Jews living among them to go aboard some boats they had lying ready, taking their wives and children. There was no hint of any intention to harm them. There had been a public vote by the citizens, and the Jews accepted, as well they might, being peaceable people with no reason to suspect anything. But once out in the open sea, they were all sent to the bottom, a company of at least 200. When Judas heard of the cruel fate of his countrymen, he issued his orders to his men, and after invoking God, the just judge, he attacked his brother's murderers. Under cover of dark, he set fire to the port, burned the boats, and put to the sword everyone who had taken refuge there. As the town gates were closed, he withdrew, intending to come back and wipe out the whole community of Joppa. But hearing that the people of Jamnia were planning to treat their resident Jews in the same way, he made a night attack on the Jamnites and fired the port with its fleet. The glow of the flames were seen as far as Jerusalem, 30 miles away. When they had left the town barely a mile behind them in their advance on Timotheus, Judas was attacked by an Arab force of at least 5,000 foot soldiers with 500 cavalry. A fierce engagement followed, and with God's help, Judas's men won the day. The defeated nomads begged Judas to offer them the right hand of friendship and promised to surrender their herds and make themselves generally useful to him. Realizing that they might indeed prove valuable in many ways, Judas consented to make peace with them, and after an exchange of pledges, the Arabs withdrew to their tents. Judas also attacked a certain fortified town, closed by ramparts and inhabited by a medley of races. Its name was Caspin. Confident in the strength of their walls and their stock of provisions, the besieged adopted an insolent attitude to Judas and his men, reinforcing their insults with blasphemies and profanity. But Judas and his men invoked the great sovereign of the world, who without battering ram or siege engine had overthrown Jericho in the days of Joshua. They then made a fierce assault on the wall. By God's will, having captured the town, they made such indescribable slaughter that the nearby lake, a quarter of a mile across, seemed filled to overflowing with blood. 95 miles further on from there, they reached the Cherex, in the country of Jews known as Tubians. They did not find Timotheus himself in that neighborhood. He had already left the district, having achieved nothing apart from leaving a very strong garrison at one point. Dositheus and Sosipater, two of the Maccabean generals, marched out and destroyed the force of Timotheus that he had left behind in the fortress, amounting to more than 10,000 men. Maccabees himself divided his army into cohorts to which he assigned commanders, and then hurried in pursuit of Timotheus, whose troops numbered 120,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. Timotheus' first move on learning of Judas's advance was to send away the women and the children and the rest of the baggage train to the place called the Carnium, since it was an impregnable position, difficult of access owing to the narrowness of all the approaches. Judas's cohort came in sight first. The enemy, seized with fright and panic-stricken by the manifestation of the all-seeing, began to flee, one running this way and one running that, often wounding one another in consequence and running on the points of one another's swords. Judas persuaded them with a wheel, cutting the sinners to pieces and killing something like 30,000 men. Timotheus himself, having fallen into the hands of Dositheus, and Sosipater, and their men, very craftily pleaded with them to let him go with his life, on the grounds that he had the relatives and even the brothers of many of them in his power, and that these could otherwise expect short shrift. When at long last he convinced them that he would honor his promise and return these people safe and sound, they let him go for the sake of saving their brothers. Reaching the Carnaeum and the Atargedian, Judas slaughtered 25,000 men. Having defeated and destroyed them, he led his army against Ephron, a fortified town, where Licinius was living. Stalwart young men, drawn up outside the walls, offered vigorous resistance, while inside there were quantities of war engines and missiles in reserve. But the Jews, having invoked the sovereign, who by his power shatters enemies' defenses, gained control of the town and cut down nearly 25,000 of the people inside. Moving off from there, they pressed on to Scythopolis, 75 miles from Jerusalem. But as the Jews who had settled there assured Judas that the people of Scythopolis had always treated them well, and had been particularly kind to them when times were at their worst, he and his men thanked them and urged them to extend the same friendship to his race in the future. They reached Jerusalem shortly before the Feast of Weeks. After Pentecost, as it is called, they marched against Gorgias, the general commanding Idumea. He came out at the head of 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. In the course of the ensuing battle, a few Jews lost their lives. A man called Dositheus, a horseman of the Tubian contingent, a valiant man, overpowered Gorgias, and gripping him by the cloak was forcibly dragging him along, intending to take the accursed man alive. But one of the Thracian cavalry, hurling himself on Dositheus, slashed his shoulder, and Gorgias escaped to Marissa. Meanwhile, since Astrius and his men had been fighting for a long time and were exhausted, Judas called on the Lord to show himself their ally and leader in battle. Then, chanting the battle cry and hymns at the top of his voice in his ancestral tongue, by a surprise attack he routed Gorgias's troops. Judas then rallied his army and moved on to the town of Adullam, where, as it was the 7th day of the week, they purified themselves according to custom and kept the Sabbath. Next day they came to find Judas, since the necessity was by now urgent, to have the bodies of the fallen taken up and laid to rest among their relatives in their ancestral tombs. But when they found on each of the dead men, under their tunics, objects dedicated to the idols of Jamnia, which the law prohibits to Jews, it became clear to everyone that this was why these men had lost their lives. And then, blessed the ways of the Lord, the upright judge who brings hidden things to light, and gave themselves to prayer, begging that the sin committed might be completely forgiven. Next, the valiant Judas urged the soldiers to keep themselves free from all sin, having seen with their own eyes the effects of the sin of those who had fallen. After this, he took a collection from them individually, amounting to nearly 2,000 drachmas, and sent it to Jerusalem to have a sacrifice for sin offered, an action altogether fine and noble, prompted by his belief in the resurrection. For he had not expected the fallen to rise again. It would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. Whereas if he had viewed the splendid recompense reserved for those who make a pious end, the thought was holy and devout. Hence he had the expiatory sacrifice offered for the dead, so that they might be released from their sin. Chapter 13 of the second Maccabees. In the year 149, Judas and his men discovered that Antiochus Eupator was advancing in force against Judea, and with him Lysias, his tutor and chief minister. He had moreover a Greek force of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 cavalry, 22 elephants, and 300 chariots fitted with scythes. Menelaus, too, joined them, and very craftily kept urging Antiochus on, not for the welfare of his own country, but in the hope of being restored to office. But the King of Kings stirred up the anger of Antiochus against the guilty wretch. And when Lysias made it clear to the king that Menelaus was the cause of all the troubles, Antiochus gave orders for him to be taken to Berea, or Berio, Beroea, Beroe, and there put to death by the local method of execution. In that place there is a tower 50 cubits high, full of ash, with an internal lip all round, overhanging the ashes. If anyone is convicted of sacrilegious theft or of some other heinous crime, he is taken up to the top and pushed over to perish. In such a manner was the renegade fated to die. Menelaus had not even the privilege of burial, deserved justice. This, since he had committed many sins against the altar, the fire and ashes of which were holy. It was in ashes that he met his death. The king then was advancing his mind, filled with barbarous designs, to give the Jews a demonstration of far worse things than anything that had happened under his father. When Judas heard of this, he ordered the people day and night to call on the Lord as never before, to come to the help of those who were in peril of being deprived of the law, their fatherland, and the holy temple, and not to allow the people, just when they were beginning to breathe again, to fall into the power of ill-famed foreigners. When they had all, with one voice, obeyed his instructions and had made their petitions to the merciful Lord, weeping, fasting, and prostrating themselves for 3 days continuously, Judas spoke words of encouragement and told them to keep close to him. After separate consultation with the elders, he resolved not to wait for the king's army to invade Judea and take possession of the city, but to march out and settle the whole matter with the Lord's help. Having thus committed the outcome to the Creator of the world, and having exhorted his soldiers to fight bravely to the death for the laws, the temple, the city, their country, and their way of life, he encamped his army near Modian. Giving his men the password, "Victory from God," he made a night attack on the king's pavilion with a picked band of the bravest young men. Inside the camp, he destroyed about 2,000, and his men cut down the largest of the elephants with its mahout. Having eventually filled the camp with terror and confusion, they successfully withdrew, just as dawn was breaking. This was achieved thanks to the protection which the Lord granted Judas. The king, having had a taste of Jewish daring, now tried to capture their positions by trickery. He advanced on Beth-sur, a strong fortress of the Jews, but was checked, overcome, and so repulsed. Judas supplied the garrison with what they needed, but Rhodicus of the Jewish army supplied the enemy with secret information. The man was identified, arrested, and dealt with. A second time the king parleyed with the garrison at Beth-sur. He offered and accepted pledges of friendship, retired, then attacked Judas and his men, but lost the battle. He was then told that Philip, left in charge of affairs, had rebelled in Antioch. He was stunned by this, opened negotiations with the Jews, came to an agreement, and swore to abide by all reasonable conditions. Agreement reached, he offered a sacrifice, honored the temple, and made generous gifts to the holy place. He received Maccabees kindly, and leaving Hegemonides to exercise command from Ptolemais to the territory of the Gerenians, went to Ptolemais. The inhabitants of the place disapproved of the treaty. They complained furiously and wanted to annul its provisions. Lysias mounted the rostrum and made a convincing defense of the provisions, which convinced and calmed them and won their goodwill. He then withdrew to Antioch. So much for the episode of the king's offensive and retreat. This should finish up. We're going to start in chapter 14. I'm going to see if there's... Okay. This is the final part. The conflict with Nicanor, general of Demetrius I, the day of Nicanor. Alchemist, the high priest, intervenes. Chapter 14. 3 years after this, Judas and his men learned that Demetrius, son of Seleucus, had landed at the port of Tripolis with a strong army and a fleet, and that he had occupied the country and had killed Antiochus and his tutor Lysias. A certain Alchemist, a former high priest, had willfully incurred defilement at the time of the insurrection. Realizing that whichever way he turned, there was no security for him, nor any further access to the holy altar, he went to King Demetrius in about the year 151 and presented him with a golden crown and a palm, together with the traditional olive branches from the temple. There, for that day, he let the matter rest. Presently, he found an opportunity to further his mad plan. When Demetrius called him into his council and questioned him about the dispositions and intentions of the Jews, he replied, "Those Jews called Hasidians who are led by Judas Maccabees, are war mongers and rebels who are preventing the kingdom from finding stability. This is why, after being deprived of my hereditary dignity, I mean the high priesthood, I have come here now, first out of genuine concern for the king's interest, and secondly, out of a regard for our own fellow citizens, because the irresponsible behavior of those I have mentioned has brought no slight misery on our entire race. When your Majesty has taken note of all these points, may it please you to make provision for the welfare of our country and our oppressed nation, as befits the gracious benevolence you extend to all. For as long as Judas remains alive, the state will never enjoy peace. No sooner had he spoken thus than the rest of the king's friends, who were hostile to Judas' activities, stoked Demetrius's anger. The latter at once selected Nicanor, then commander of the elephants, promoted him to the command of Judea, and dispatched him with instructions to dispose of Judas, disperse his followers, and install Alcimus as high priest of the greatest of temples. The foreigners in Judea, who had fled before Judas, flocked to join Nicanor, thinking that the misfortunes and troubles of the Jews would be to their own advantage. At this point, Nicanor makes friends with Judas. When the Jews heard that Nicanor was coming and that the foreigners were about to attack, they sprinkled dust over themselves and made supplication to him who had established his people forever, and who never failed to support his own heritage by direct manifestations. On their leader's orders, they at once left the place where they were and confronted the enemy at the village of Saul. Simon, brother of Judas, engaged Nicanor, but owing to the sudden arrival of the enemy, suffered a slight reverse. Nicanor, however, had heard how brave Judas and his men were, and how resolutely they always fought for their country, and he did not dare allow bloodshed to decide the issue. And so he sent Posidonius and Theodotus and Mattathias to offer the Jews pledges of friendship and to accept theirs. After careful consideration of his terms, the leader communicated them to his troops, and since they were all clearly of one mind, they agreed to the treaty. A day was fixed on which the respective leaders were to meet as individuals. A litter came out from either side, and seats were set up. Judas had posted armed men in strategic positions in case of a sudden treacherous move by the enemy. The leaders held their conference and reached agreement. Nicanor took up residence in Jerusalem and did nothing out of place there. Indeed, he sent away the crowds that had flocked to join him. He kept Judas constantly with him, becoming deeply attached to him, and encouraged him to marry and have children. Judas married, settled down, and led a normal life. Alcimus rekindles hostilities, and Nicanor threatens the temple. When Alcimus saw how friendly the two men had become, he went to Demetrius with a copy of the treaty they had signed and told him that Nicanor was harboring thoughts against the interest of the state, and was planning that Judas an enemy of the realm, should fill the next vacancy among the friends of the king. The king flew into a rage, roused by the slanders of this villain. He wrote to Nicanor, telling him of his strong displeasure at these agreements and ordering him immediately to send Maccabees to Antioch in chains. When the letter reached Nicanor, he was very much upset, for he disliked the prospect of breaking an agreement with a man who had done nothing wrong. Since, however, there was no way of opposing the king, he waited for an opportunity to carry out the order by a stratagem. Maccabeus began to notice that Nicanor was treating him more sharply, and that his manner of speaking to him was more abrupt than it had been. And he concluded that such sharpness could have no very good motive. He therefore collected a considerable number of his followers and got away from Nicanor. The latter, realizing that the man had well and truly outmaneuvered him, went to the greatest and holiest of temples, when the priests were offering the customary sacrifices, and ordered them to surrender Judas. When they protested on oath that they did not know where the wanted man could be, he stretched out his right hand towards the temple and swore this oath: "If you do not hand Judas over to me as prisoner, I shall raze this dwelling of God to the ground. I shall demolish the altar, and on this very spot I shall erect a splendid temple to Dionysus." With these words he left them. The priest stretched out his hands to heaven, calling on him who has at all times done battle for our nation, and this was their prayer: "O Lord, in need of nothing, it has pleased you that the temple where you dwell should be here with us. Now therefore, Holy Lord of all holiness, preserve forever from all profanation this house, so newly purified." The death of Rhasis. Now a man called Rhasis, one of the elders of Jerusalem, was denounced to Nicanor. He was a man who loved his countrymen and stood high in their esteem, and he was known of the father of the Jews because of his kindness. In the earlier days of the insurrection, he had been convicted of Judaism, and he had risked both life and limb for Judaism with the utmost zeal. Nicanor, by the way of demonstrating the enmity he had for the Jews, sent over 500 soldiers to arrest him, reckoning that if he eliminated this man, he would be dealing them a severe blow. When the troops were on the point of capturing the tower and were forcing the outer door and calling for fire to set the doors alight, Rhasis, finding himself completely surrounded, fell on his sword, nobly resolving to die rather than fall into the clutches of these villains and suffer outrages unworthy of his noble birth. But in the heat of conflict he missed his thrust, and while the troops swarmed in through the doorways, he ran nimbly upstairs to the parapet and manfully threw himself down among the troops. But as they immediately drew back, he fell into the middle of the empty space. Still breathing and blazing with anger, he struggled to his feet, blood spurting in all directions, and despite his terrible wounds, ran right through the crowd. Then, taking his stand on a steep rock, although he had now lost every drop of blood, he tore out his entrails, and taking them in both hands, flung them down on the crowd, calling on the master of his life and spirit to give them back to him one day. And thus he died. Nicanor's blasphemies, chapter 15. Nicanor heard that Judas and his men were in the neighborhood of Samaria. So he decided to attack them at no risk to himself on the day of rest. Those Jews who had been compelled to follow him said, "Do not massacre them in such a savage, barbarous way. Respect the day on which the all-seeing has conferred a special holiness." At this, the triple-dyed scoundrel asked if there were in heaven a sovereign who had ordered the keeping of the Sabbath day. When they answered, "The living Lord himself, the heavenly sovereign, has ordered the observance of the seventh day," he retorted, "And I, as sovereign on earth, order you to take up arms and do the king's business," for all that he did not manage to carry out his wicked plan. While Nicanor, in his unlimited boastfulness and pride, was planning to erect a general trophy with the spoils taken from Judas and his men, Maccabees remained firm in his confident conviction that the Lord would stand by him. He urged his men not to be dismayed by the foreigners' attacks, but, keeping in mind the help that had come to them from heaven in the past, to be confident that this time too victory would be theirs with the help of the Almighty. He put fresh heart into them by citing the law and the prophets and stirring up memories of the battles they had already won. He filled them with new enthusiasm. Having thus aroused their courage, he ended his exhortation by demonstrating the treachery of the foreigners and how they had violated their oaths, having armed each one of them, not so much with the safety given by shield and lance, as with that confidence which springs from noble language. He encouraged them all by describing to them a convincing dream, a vision, as it were. What he had seen was this: Onias, the former high priest, that paragon of men, modest of bearing and gentle of manners, suitably eloquent and trained from boyhood in the practice of every virtue. Onias was stretching out his hands and praying for the whole Jewish community. Next, there appeared a man equally remarkable for his great age and dignity, and invested with a marvelous and impressive air of majesty. Onias began to speak. "This is a man," he said, "who loves his brothers and prays much for the people and the holy city. Jeremiah, the prophet of God." Jeremiah then stretched out his right hand and presented Judas with a golden sword, saying as he gave it, "Take this holy sword as a gift from God. With it you will shatter the enemy." The disposition of the combatants, encouraged by the noble words of Judas, which had the power to inspire valor and give the young the spirit of mature men. They decided not to entrench themselves in a camp, but bravely to take the offensive and, in hand-to-hand fighting, to commit the result to the fortune of war. Since the city, their holy religion, and the temple were in danger, their concern for their wives and children, their brothers and relatives, had shrunk to minute importance. Their chief and greatest fear was for the consecrated temple. Those left behind in the city felt a similar anxiety, alarmed as they were about the forthcoming encounter in the open country. Everyone now awaited the coming issue. The enemy had already concentrated their forces and stood formed up in order of battle, with the elephants drawn up in a strategic position and the cavalry disposed on the wings. Maccabees took note of these masses confronting him, the glittering array of armor, and the fierce aspect of the elephants. Then, raising his hands to heaven, he called on the Lord, who works miracles, in the knowledge that it is not by force of arms, but as he sees fit to decide, that victory is granted by him to such as deserve it. His prayer was worded thus: You, Master, sent your angel in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judea, and he destroyed no less than 185,000 of Sennacherib's army. Now, once again, sovereign of heaven, send a good angel before us to spread terror and dismay. May these men be struck down by the might of your arm, since they have come with blasphemy on their lips to attack your holy people. And on these words he finished the defeat and death of Nicanor. Nicanor and his men advanced to the sound of trumpets and war songs, but the men of Judas closed with the enemy, uttering invocations and prayers, fighting with their hands and praying to God in their hearts. They cut down at least 35,000 men and were greatly cheered by this manifestation of God. When the engagement was over and they were withdrawing in triumph, they recognized Nicanor lying dead in full armor. With shouting and confusion all around, they blessed the sovereign master in their ancestral tongue. He who, as protagonist, had devoted himself, body and soul, to his fellow citizens, and had preserved the love he felt even in youth for those of his own race, gave orders for Nicanor's head to be cut off, with his arm up to the shoulder, and taken to Jerusalem. When he arrived there himself, he called his countrymen together, stationed the priest in front of the altar, and then sent for the people from the citadel. He showed them the head of the abominable Nicanor, and the hand which this infamous man had stretched out so insolently against the holy house of the Almighty. Then, cutting out godless Nicanor's tongue, he gave orders for it to be fed piecemeal to the birds, and for the salary of his folly to be hung up in front of the temple. At this, everyone sent blessings heavenwards to the glorious Lord, saying, Blessed be he who has preserved his holy place from pollution. He hung Nicanor's head from the citadel, a clear and evident sign to all of the help of the Lord. They all decreed by public vote never to let that day go by unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar. In Aramaic, the eve of what is called the Day of Mordecai. Compiler's Epilogue. So ends the episode of Nicanor, and as since then the city has remained in the possession of the Hebrews, I shall bring my own work to an end here too. If it is well composed and to the point, that is just. If it is worthless and mediocre, that is all I could manage. Just as it is injurious to drink wine by itself, or again water alone, whereas wine mixed with water is pleasant, and produces a delightful sense of well-being, so skill in presenting the incidents is what delights the understanding of those who read the book. And here I close.